Well, I want to start off by saying thank you, Hunter, for letting a Wyoming herper come and talk to Colorado folks. So bear with me here. So yeah, I'll be sharing some of my master's research with you guys. And so in general, when animals have to make choices about where to live in their environment, we would expect them to choose places that benefit them in some way, right? Like selecting an area that has good resources, provides shelter or refuge from predators, or allows them to be physically comfortable. Whenever we're thinking about assessing habitat selection of animals, we want to think about the biology of that animal and how their habitat preferences could change across different times of the year. For example, grizzly bears might be found near rivers during the peak of salmon run to utilize this important resource. But in the middle of winter, they're preferring to be in den sites so that they can successfully overwinter. And so if we don't consider the time at which animals are selecting habitat preferences and consider those changes across years, we can make incorrect conclusions about what's important to them and when it's important to them. And in addition to thinking about changes in seasonality,
I'm going to interrupt this presentation for a second.
I think you could put that in front of that over there and it would take care of all of that, right?
That's true. Yeah.
It's sort of hard to see now. And you could,
Nope.
you could either put
Just
either
bring it
of
closer.
those.
Yeah. And how do I take that off?
That's probably that. Well, maybe we'll cut off. It's okay. Yeah.
thank you. It looks good from the computer from what I can see, so I had no idea. All right, so in addition to thinking about how habitat choices could change across the year, thinking about the proper spatial scales is also important. For example, if we were to zoom out of this image of a Florida swamp, we may conclude that this heron is mainly selecting this area for water. But if we also zoom in on a smaller spatial scale, we might see that there are times when this heron is in water, but also utilizing trees. And so by combining both different times of the year as well as different spatial scales, this allows us to get a more holistic understanding of habitat selection for that animal. And understanding habitat requirements for amphibians is particularly important because they are one of the most threatened vertebrate classes globally. And some of their main threats is related to chytrid fungus, habitat loss, and habitat degradation. So this brings me to my study species, the wood frog, which exists as two isolated populations in Wyoming, as well as in northern Colorado. So this talk is relevant for you guys. It's considered a species of greatest conservation need in the state of Wyoming, and this is because we already know that chytrid fungus is present in these systems, and we have a lack in understanding of their habitat requirements. And so therefore, we asked, what habitat types and characteristics are adult wood frogs selecting across spatial scales? And how does their habitat selection change seasonally? To answer this question, we conducted radiotelemetry of adult wood frogs across 2 different field seasons, and we relocated each individual once a week. 170 wood frogs were tracked between the 2 field seasons. We got 1 to 17 relocations per individual, and we did radiotelemetry between mid-May to mid-October in both years. So we expected wood frogs to select habitat types and characteristics that would allow them to thermoregulate properly, avoid predation, and maintain moist skin. To analyze habitat selection, we first found where the frog was and we collected a suite of habitat metrics. We collected the same information at 3 locations that we considered available to that frog, but where it was not there at that time. By measuring the same habitat metrics and comparing available to use, this gives us an idea of what these frogs are honing in on. We also looked at habitat selection across 2 different seasons. Our first one we're calling spring and summer, which is when breeding and summer foraging occurs. And this was mid-May to mid-September. And then our second season we're calling the fall, and this was mid-September to mid-October, when adults were looking for a hibernacula to brumate. So we looked at habitat selection across 3 spatial scales. our largest spatial scale we're calling the macrohabitat scale. And at this scale, we looked at general land cover type, as well as measured the distance to the closest water body. And we did the same thing at 3 available locations that were around 300 meters away from where that frog was found. And so across both of these seasons, we found that wood frogs had preference for more aspens, more wet meadows or pond edges, more willow patches, and to be closer to water bodies. But we did see one difference in that during the spring and summer, they also selected for more water, and during the fall, they selected for more forest. Zooming into our next spatial scale, which I'm terming as the microhabitat patch, this is where we centered a 1 meter squared plot around the frog's location, and we measured average vegetation height, as well as canopy cover at frog height. And we also visually estimated different types of vegetation categories within the surrounding patch. Measured the same variables at 3 available locations that were between 2 to 20 meters from the frog. And now at our finest spatial scale was the frog's exact location. We looked at soil humidity, distance to refuge, which is a place that we said that frog could visually disappear, litter depth, and ground temperature. And again, measured this at 3 paired locations that were between 2 to 20 meters from that frog. And so we found that wood frogs were were in water about 25% of the time, and then found on more terrestrial locations 75% of the time. And so at these smaller scales, we wanted to break down habitat selection whenever they're found in aquatic habitats versus terrestrial habitats. And so looking at the microhabitat patch during the spring and summer, when we found wood frogs in water, they preferred patches that had higher canopy cover. Now remember, we measured this at frog height, so a thick patch of grass like this can indicate high canopy cover for a frog. So this is an example of a habitat plot where the blue flag indicates where we found a frog. So in addition to higher canopy cover, when wood frogs were in water, they actually selected for patches that had less surrounding water. And my interpretation of this is that they're selecting small little puddles like this, or being on the edges of ponds. And this lined up with what we found at their exact location, where they preferred to be in shallower water depths compared to available locations. And now looking at our microhabitat patch during the spring and summer when we found them on terrestrial areas, they preferred patches that had more surrounding water, as well as patches that had more grass present. And at their exact location, we found that they preferred to be closer to water, closer to areas where they could hide or closer to refuge, and higher soil humidity. And so as a quick summary, at our largest spatial scale, we found that wood frogs did have similar preferences for some of these macrohabitat types, but that during the spring and summer they did select for more water, and during the fall they selected for more forest. And if we combine these two smaller spatial scales together, wood frogs are preferring this mixture of aquatic and moist terrestrial habitat types that allow them to find a place to hide and get camouflage, to be near water, and that also has moist terrestrial habitat nearby. And I'll just quickly mention that for both of these scales, during the fall, we did not find any selection for the habitat variables that we measured. And so now we have a general understanding of what wood frogs prefer during the spring and summer. And we know that chytrid fungus is present on the landscape, but we haven't witnessed any mass die-offs. We wanted to ask, are wood frogs changing their habitat preferences when they were BD positive? And just as a quick reminder, chytrid fungus thrives best in cool, moist environments. And the impetus for this question is from one of my previous lab mates named Gabriel, who looked at habitat selection of boreal toads in northwestern Wyoming. He found that when boreal toads were BD positive, that they would actually exhibit habitat switching and would select microhabitat patches that were warmer, drier, and more open, and they were actually able to clear themselves of infection. And since we know that wood frogs are semi-terrestrial, we first wanted to start out by asking, are wood frogs showing preferences for terrestrial locations when they're BD positive? And we found that no, they are not. And so we thought, well, maybe just the drive to be in water at times is more important than dealing with this chytrid fungus. So therefore, we just looked at terrestrial locations next, and we asked, are wood frogs selecting terrestrial microhabitats that allow them to clear their BD status? And to answer this, we looked at soil humidity to get an idea of how wet that habitat was. We estimated canopy cover and percent shrub to get an idea of how open that patch was. And lastly, we measured ground temperature to get an idea of how warm that microhabitat patch was. And what we found was that no, they did not exhibit similar behaviors to boreal toads, and they actually did the opposite, and they selected for higher soil humidity when they were BD positive. And so the answer to our question is, wood frogs did not exhibit changes in their habitat preferences with changes in their chytrid fungus status. And so some potential explanations for this might be that they have other strategies for dealing with chytrid fungus, such as their microbiome or their genetics. And so just to tie some of my research together and thinking about conservation implications for the species, I think that these macro habitats can be linked to microhabitats. So a lot of these ponds that we find wood frogs at my study sites, we have aspens, willow patches, and wet meadows nearby. And early on in the summer, these areas can be fairly inundated and semi-aquatic with snowmelt. And I believe that this can extend the semi-aquatic habitat from the breeding pond and increase foraging opportunities for these species. In addition to that, they can also promote those mixture of moist terrestrial microhabitat with little wet puddles at the microhabitat scale. And so by having these guys or having these different macrohabitats nearby and promoting their persistence, we're also allowing the appropriate microhabitats that they prefer. And if they are near adjacent ponds, can serve as really valuable movement corridors for these species. And just more broadly, I think my work demonstrates why we need to look at habitat selection for an animal across more than one spatial scale, because we could miss out on important features that they may be selecting for or need. And so I'd like to thank my advisors, Dr. Anna Chalfoun and Dr. Lusha Tronstad. I'd also like to thank the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for funding my project. And if I have any time, I will take some questions. That's a good question. So what sorts of things are they cueing in on, and how is that maybe related to what sort of spatial scale that is? Yeah. I kind of assume that with these guys being fairly small, they're cueing in on smaller patches, but that these larger patches are influencing those characteristics at smaller scales. So I would assume more like moisture, cover, some of those microhabitat, frog location stuff is what I would assume that they're cueing in on, and that the prevalence of those being there is linked to some of this macrohabitat that promotes that. Is my general understanding at the moment. Go ahead.
Were all your sites BD positive, and did you see any die-offs from that?
Yeah, so the question was, are any of my sites were they all BD positive, and if I saw any die-offs. So I did radiotelemetry at 5 different sites across the Snowy Mountain Range, and all of them were BD positive. And one of the reasons I was able to ask my question about habitat switching with disease is because we found individuals that one week they would test positive and the next week they test negative. And so look at, well, what could maybe explain these changes? And that's why we asked that question. But we did not witness any die-offs. I did not come across a frog that I felt confident died because of chytrid fungus.
Well, you indicated early on that these are pretty special populations. Can you tell us a little bit about their conservation status, their trends, any ongoing particular efforts to protect them or to protect habitat for them, that kind of thing?
Yeah, okay. So the question is just about what sort of conservation measures are being put in for the species. Yeah, I may be biased, but they are pretty special. They're glacial relic populations, both in the Bighorn Mountains and here and in southern Wyoming. And so we don't know a lot about them because they're very different from where we find them in other parts of the country. Some of them even look a little different physically based on like patterns and markings, like in the Bighorns compared to the eastern part. And I'm hoping that my work, because this is the first time someone has looked at habitat selection of wood frogs in Wyoming, so my research is part of the start of, I think, informing conservation related to these species. And Wendy could speak more if I haven't, as far as conservation implications about them. But I'm hoping to inform other agencies of how we could best promote their existence and keep them there.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you maybe have already done this or considered measuring the actual frog's body temperature with a thermocouple or something. Considering like the microhabitat selection, if they are warmer, they might be losing moisture more quickly. So maybe that's an explanation for choosing those higher moisture habitats.
Yeah, so we did actually measure body temperature. And one explanation that I can think of for why they would select higher soil humidity is because I know sometimes when they have a bad chytrid infection, they can experience skin hardening or skin drying. And so as actually a response of being chytrid positive, they might be seeking moisture habitat to get refuge from feeling dry. And so that's another potential. Yeah.
So I'm curious, it's hard to track frogs to their hibernaculum, but you were able to do that. I was curious how far away from the wetlands, what was the range of distances that you found hibernaculum?
Thank you for asking me that question. I was prepared. I really wanted to show this at some point. So this just shows real quickly, I don't know how you can see it because of the color, but each of those points are an individual relocation. And whites, each color is a different frog. And so this is an example of our frog that moved the farthest. So in the white, this was a female. She moved from this breeding pond and moved a little over 300 meters away to go to a wet meadow. She didn't exactly start to overwinter yet, but that's the farthest we got, and that was in 1 week that we found. So I would just love to know, to answer the question, how many hops did it take her to get that far? And I think part of the reasons we didn't get, potential reasons we didn't get anything for our hibernacular results is we did have a small subset that we followed to overwintering because transmitters would fall off, battery life would die, and we only had so many at the end of the field season. So it'd be great to increase sample size looking at that moving forward. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
I've got one more.
Oh, Randy.
Is it true that wood frogs are the best?
Yeah. It's a no